The Joe Rogan Experience.
One of the things you talked about was that there was this transference, like the Eucharist eventually became a placebo. Do you think that what do you think it was initially? Do you think it was a psychedelic mushroom?
So that's Allegro certainly thought that, right?
Right. John Marco Allegro, author of The Sacred Mushroom and the Scroll.
So he releases that book in 1970, and he claims that Christianity is the guise for a Near Eastern fertility cult. And I think it's very interesting, but there aren't many linguists who support the proposition.
Right. There's a lot of people that disagree with him pretty heavily, right?
I mean, from like a purely linguistic perspective, it's, to explain it briefly, so he says that...
Did you read this, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross?
Yeah.
Did you read it?
Several times.
Did you read the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth as well?
From Allegro.
Yeah, that's the one that was... So the Catholic Church bought out the original one, right? And it was very difficult to get a hold of for the longest time. You had to buy copies of it.
I've heard rumors to that effect, yes.
Yeah, and then he comes out with the second book, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth. What did you knowing as much as you know about language?
Yeah.
Like what did you feel like he made leaps? Did you feel like he made these connections that maybe were based on speculation?
So he writes, it's pure philology, right? So it's word games and things that only linguists, I think it's incredible that people who aren't linguists can actually read that. It's really, really difficult to read Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. But the basic premise is that the New Testament, written in Greek, has this Semitic substratum. So underneath the Greek, the author, the gospel writers and Paul are actually referring to different terms in Hebrew or Aramaic, and that these terms have in turn come from the Sumerian, which any linguist would say is a language isolate, that there is no real relationship between Sumerian and the Indo-European languages like Greek and the Semitic. So the premise of the argument is something that most linguists don't accept. However, and Carl Ruck has written the afterword to one of the editions you probably have of Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And he gets into some complex theories about psycholinguistics and this interesting idea that just because they aren't related, there are certain words, certain names, certain vocabulary, like plant definitions, which would carry across the different languages. And I find that somewhat interesting. But when you dig into the words that Allegro was recreating, he places an asterisk actually next to these words because they can't be corroborated by the ancient texts. So some of these Sumerian words he straight up hypothesizes as existing, but they can't really be found in the existing tablets. So it's hard to correlate some of those meanings he draws down from the Sumerian. But that said, he makes very interesting claims. For example, like in 1 Corinthians 22, there's this interesting line where he says about we preach Christ crucified is a skandalon for the Jews and a folly for the Greeks. And skandalon in Greek means like a bolt or a snare, like a trap. And Allegro ties it to like a tikla in Aramaic, which is like what he calls the bolt mushroom, and in Sumerian ukushtigila. And so he's saying that Paul's actually telling the Jews that the Christ crucified is a mushroom instead of a skandalon. It's like a code word. Like the skandalon is a mushroom, and then for the Greeks, he says it's a folly, which is moira in Greek, which actually means mandrake, which is another psychedelic plant. So there's all this different wordplay going on, but it's really hard to tease out any physical forensic evidence for this stuff, which was what I went after.
Was Allegro's position, if I recall correctly, that the sacred mushroom was Amanita muscaria?
Yeah, that was even the cover of his book. It was a photo of Amanita muscaria.
And that's where I think Allegro did amazing work, but that's one area where I have a problem with Amanita muscaria as the psychedelic of choice in early Christianity, because in shamanic cultures where Amanita muscaria is used, it's recognized that the mushroom is much more effective after it's been passed through a human body, or indeed through the body of a reindeer, and emerged in urine. And so those shamanistic cultures of Siberia use Amanita muscaria by drinking it in the urine of a shaman who has previously consumed the mushroom. And I don't see a lot of evidence for that in early Christianity. And it's why I like the work that Brian has done, looking at the really hard evidence for psychedelics in early Christianity, which are not in this case Amanita muscaria, if I'm correct, Brian.
Isn't the speculation about Amanita muscaria that it's seasonable? It's seasonal. It's also genetically variable. Like there's different species of it, like much like different fruits taste differently. There's different versions of the Amanita muscaria that have more psychedelic compounds in them, and then there's all sorts of ways of preparing them that we've completely lost. Am I getting this wrong? 'Cause I've only had one Amanita muscaria experience, and it wasn't very convincing.
Yeah, and this is often the case, but I'm told, I've not had the experience myself, but I'm told that if you can bear the idea of drinking the shaman's urine after he or she has consumed the Amanita muscaria, you will have a really powerful journey.
Yeah, but you don't want a shaman just laughing hysterically after you drink his urine.
Yes, absolutely.
The joke's on you, stupid. Yeah. There's also so many correlations between the Amanita muscaria and Santa Claus to shamans. There's so
the colors, the red and white.
Yes. Yeah. There's also the bag, the toys, the fact that they would dry them on these coniferous trees, the fact that these mushrooms have this mycorrhizal relationship with coniferous trees, where they tend to grow under pine trees, which is the tree that we use for Christmas trees. The fact that they're bright red, like a toy that is in a package waiting for a child to open it up. There's so many of these weird connections. The colors, the fact that reindeer are with Santa Claus, the fact these reindeer fly
through the heavens.
Yeah, I mean, and that caribou are notoriously attracted to Amanita muscaria mushrooms. In fact, people that have had psychedelic rituals and gone outside to urinate have talked about caribou knocking them over to try to get to their urine. And caribou are reindeer. They have been observed eating these things. So they have this weird relationship. All those things are together, connected in some sort of a strange way. And there's also a history of shamanic rituals being outlawed in Siberia, and the way they got around it was they would come through the chimney, which is just crazy. They would climb onto people's roofs and slide down the chimney to deliver the mushrooms.
It's just another example of the way that our culture takes an ancient historical truth and completely castrates it and turns it into Santa Claus. Whereas what we're actually dealing with are profound experiences in deeply altered states of consciousness.
Well, it's also, this information seems to have been lost fairly recently, because if you go back to the early 1950s and 40s, and look at Christmas cards. The Christmas cards and depictions of Christmas almost always contained elves and Amanita muscaria mushrooms. The Amanita muscaria mushroom was synonymous with Christmas for some strange reason. Have you ever seen those old? Yeah, it's crazy, right? Yeah. Like, what is that?
Like, it's all over the fairy tale books too. You can't avoid the Amanita. Yeah. Everywhere you look, which is why I think Allegro was also interested, writing in 1970 and studying it in the 50s and 60s. I think that's why he glommed onto the Amanita.
But it's such an unconvincing mushroom. Like the people that I know that have experienced it in terms of a psychedelic ritual, it's just, I don't know anybody who's really blown their brains out with it.
No, and Gordon Wasson also thought it was the ingredient behind soma as well. He writes a book about this in 1968, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. That was his guess too for soma.
But Wasson was experienced with psilocybin, which is so universally regarded as being effective. That's why it's so confusing.
I always found that strange too, to be honest. So Wasson, I mean, to explain where this comes from, Wasson has this incredible experience with Maria Sabina in 1955 in Oaxaca, Mexico, when he consumes we think psilocybe mexicana. And he is catapulted to the heavens, and he has this vision that he describes as the realest thing he's ever experienced under the influence of the psilocybin. And the thought occurs to him, he writes later in 1957 in Life magazine. He says that could it be the case that the divine mushrooms are in fact the answer behind the ancient mysteries? which is why he then went and started looking at the Amanita, perhaps, or eventually ergot, which is where I pick up the scent. At some point in his correspondence with Albert Hofmann, they together began focusing on ergot, like we said, because it's so common and so natural, but so highly toxic too. And Albert claimed to have this experience with it, and so for years and years, after teaming up with Carl Ruck, they were convinced that ergot had to somehow be involved.
Episodes of the Joe Rogan Experience are now free on Spotify. That's right, they're free. From September 1st to December 1st, they're going to be available everywhere, but after December 1st, they will only be available on Spotify, but they will be free. That includes the video. The video will also be there. It'll also be free. That's all we're asking. Just go download Spotify. Much love. Bye-bye.